Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today. Tacitus Day, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the interesting and rather complex subject, and I'll try and be as reductive as I can on this, and at the same time sort of convey the meaning and message, which is the relationship between the width or broadness of the tax base, that is the ability of the government to extract taxes and wealth from its citizenry, and the extent to which legal rights and protection under law, Bill of Rights, the independence of courts, how all these things interact to reflect the freedoms and rights that a citizen in any particular jurisdiction may have. Now, if we look at sort of England as the mercantile age was picking up, so we're talking like 1600s, and into the 1700s there, and then of course into the industrial age, so kicking off, in the early stages in the later 1700s, but really picking up steam sort of around 1830, 1840. Britain was the centre of the mercantile age and the industrial age, or the intermediate mercantile and advanced mercantile age, and then the industrial age. Why did this little rain-swept island off the coast of Europe with quite a small population, how were they able to again really ride the mercantile age at its zenith and ride that straight into the industrial age? The relationship between freedoms, tax raising, tax methodologies, again, that broadness of the tax base and the freedoms and liberties. Because if you want to tax your citizens more widely, then you have to let them make wealth and then you tax that. The governments or jurisdictions that restrict citizens' ability, maybe through lack of opportunity or whatever, but want to have a tight extraction, say just based on agriculture and so on, then they're doomed to continue being poor and restrictive societies, given that citizens don't need or aren't given or don't know what to do with us in some cases, the rights that individual rights, that freedom of assembly, freedom of travel, this sort of thing, then the tax base doesn't become broadened and is very narrow, and there's a tight range of extraction, and therefore the citizens don't need the rights and don't get them. And they're taxed to a point where, given the tax base is narrow, then citizens are kept in a permanent cycle of poverty, and that may or may not suit the ruling elites in certain areas. You wonder why some countries, why are they perpetually poor? Why were they poor when the Europeans turned up? Why are they still poor today, long after the Europeans have gone? And they seem to be unable to break out of that cycle. And I noticed this as I was traveling around the third world, how the liberties and the rights of citizens really don't exist. Arbitrary right is all that you've got. And if you get into a tight spot, your only option is to bribe people and engage in corrupt payment. You don't have anything else, because there's no independent courts or laws that are going to be upheld. Laws are upheld arbitrarily, and courts will act corruptly, as will government officials and so on. So the ability of the individual to make wealth outside of the corrupt crony sort of economy is close to zero, and you see that, and you wonder why when you sort of go out of the city, even not far out of the downtown, and you're suddenly in an area that's almost it's Stone Age, and you wow, and that's something that is quite confronting when you first see it, as I did as a young man. But I got to accept that across much of the world, and particularly the third world, or even the lower end of the middle ranking economies, the medieval times and the medieval type of structures of society and taxation and existence are quite widespread, and of course Stone Age in the third world countries, and this is just how it is. And see the first world all white Western countries were a complete aberration to what has been a trend really throughout much of history. So coming back to why it's no sort of surprise, I think anyway, looking at this relationship, that the liberties and rights and property protections extend, not that they were perfect, by the way, they weren't, but these rights and freedoms extended to English people were at the time, and up to and including really going into much of even the late 1800s in many ways, the freedoms for English people were broader and more far-reaching and better protected under law, and again through independent courts and so on, than anywhere else in the world. Now, you could say, well, the Americans had better protections for the individual, but they were drawn and extracted directly from the British legal system anyway. So you could really see it's an extension of that. But outside of the British and the British Commonwealth, places like Australia and Canada and New Zealand and so on, outside of which again were a reflection of the British sense of freedoms and fairness and independent law rather than arbitrary law. This created a situation where the citizen was free to go and pursue wealth. Now, whether that wealth was in trading, as you would see in the mercantile age, or whether it was inventing the steam engine or inventing the light bulb or electricity or this, a whole range. The entire modern industrial world was invented largely by Britain, with many improvements, of course, and other new inventions coming out of really the white society, such as in the United States and Canada and Australia and so on. Australian inventors of, the original refrigerator was invented by an Australian, and quite a few other inventions actually. So outside of that white diaspora where these freedoms to go and pursue individual wealth existed, there were hardly any inventions. Now, there are a few inventions that in the later 1800s appeared that you would see in places like, but again, they were white countries. And again, it was only when freedoms were extended to the populace and protections under law, for example, Germany and France and so on. And Italy, northern Italy in particular. So this relationship between freedoms and tax extraction and so on was an interesting relationship, and was reflected, I believe, in the extension of freedoms. Why go and bust your ass making money or inventing anything when it's all going to get stolen from you? I mean, why would you bother? Nobody would. And in third world countries, they don't, because that's what happens. But in England, where these properties were, property was protected, or to a very large extent anyway, then people were free to go about their business and make money. Now, once they made money, they were being taxed in some way or indirect way. Now, majority of taxation in Britain was really, in the medieval times or the serf times, because there wasn't really much in the way of private industry. Everything was land based. There was trade in wool and some wine and things like that. And British wool exports actually did okay even in medieval times, but this was owned by the owners of the land in effect. So the aristocrats really owned that, and anything you wanted to do was through something that the aristocrats had a monopoly on. For example, if you wanted to mull wine or something, you had to use the aristocrats' infrastructure to do that. If you wanted to grow the grapes, it was on the aristocrats' land. If you wanted to grind grain, then it was on the aristocrats' windmill. If you wanted to take your fruit and vegetables or whatever it is, you make your wine or whatever, to the local market, it was on the horse and cart that was owned by the aristocrats. If you wanted to use a road that was an all seasons or most seasons road, that was a turnpike, that was owned by the aristocrats, who would then charge you a fee to use, and so on and so forth. So now, in addition, the monarchy used to use, this was like crony economy stuff, they would give to an aristocrat the job of collecting, say, a salt tax. So they would look at all the essentials that you kind of had to have, and salt was an essential. It would, for example, through winter, you would salt meat, so it wouldn't go rancid during winter. So salt had a everybody needed it, everybody used it. So salt was quite heavily taxed, as were other essentials, whether it be grain or corn or something like that. So it was all taxed. And that was how the government raised revenue. Now, they also had duties on imports and exports, so trade was taxed, and that was the tax base. Personal income tax didn't really exist. Now, tax in kind was collected, so there was effectively a barter. A peasant or a serf would give their labour to the aristocrat instead of giving money. The aristocrat would then allow a certain use of the facilities, for example, giving the people a house to live in. So there was no actual transaction. So it was a huge bartering system that existed at all levels, and in between the serfs as well. So one serf would exchange the eggs for the milk of the other serf, and that sort of thing. So there was that massive barter economy, but the tax extraction was fairly tight, as in there weren't many options, there weren't many things you could tax because of the type of economic activity that was going on. Now, in the case of war, the aristocrats were obliged to supply a certain number of soldiers, mounted horse soldiers or pikemen or something like that, archers or whatever, to the king or the monarch, and that would be at their expense. But again, that was primarily a bartering system that was raising that rather than direct cash. So that was the type of the economy at the time. Now, the appointing tax collectors, say in the case of salt tax or any other tax, wine tax or something, this was again a crony economy. So the aristocrat would be given, well, you'll have a monopoly. So all salt tax, maybe in this area or in this district or region, you've got a complete monopoly on that. And you can collect as much as you can extract. So there weren't actually rates that were set. If the area was affluent, then they would hit them up for a higher tax. If the area was dirt poor, then they simply couldn't pay a tax. Now, this tax could be a proportion of the salt. It could be some sort of bartering or exchange of labour, all those sorts of things could be involved. Certain amount of, say, if you grow grain on your lot, you have to give grain to the tax collector. So anyway, there were various ways and methodologies of collecting tax there, but it was a crony system. And we see that today in the public-private partnership, where effectively a company or a business is given the job of collecting a tax. It could be tolls on roads, and the toll vastly exceeds any cost of building or maintaining the road. And you see this through the monstrous profit margins, or selling public assets like electricity generation or water supply or anything like that at all. These are called today public-private partnerships, PPP. But in reality, they're as the closest approximation as you can imagine of returning to the feudal days when monopolies were granted purely for tax extraction purposes. Now, but again, though, English citizens had more rights than others, and you say, well, that's not perfect. English citizens got a pretty raw deal in many ways. Whatever the raw deal they got, it was way better than what anyone else could get in any other place in the world. So in that sense, and the recognising of private property as flawed and as you could had holes in it that you can sort of examine today, but again, relative to anywhere else in the world, it was the freest place for a citizen to be, with the most protection for private property. Now, without that protection of private property, then people wouldn't be inclined to take the sort of risks and put the sort of work into a new venture of any sort, or a new invention, the steam engine, whatever, unless they thought they were going to receive some sort of protection for it. Now, the main source of investment at the time came from the aristocrats. They're the only ones that owned the land. They're the only ones that could afford to invest in trading ventures in the mercantile age. So people like Sir Walter Raleigh and Sir Francis Drake and so on, were going around starting up colonies or starting up tobacco plantations or sugar plantations in the Caribbean or cotton and so on, and wool in Australia and so on. So this turned out to be the aristocrats had to go to the people with the technical expertise. The aristocrats didn't have the expertise to navigate ships around the world. They didn't have the tradesman expertise to build the ships and the whole range of technical expertise that was required in the mercantile age to travel around the world. I mean, they were hazardous journeys back in the day. Travel around the world, trading spices and whatever else, or trying to run down and capture Spanish ships with silver and gold on, that coming from South America. These were all, this all required a level of technical expertise that the aristocrats didn't possess, so they had to employ people with this expertise. And this was really the foundation to creating a technically expert class of people. Now, they could be self-taught, or they could be particularly gifted or have aptitude in an area such as, there's no such thing as an engineering degree back in the days when the steam engine was invented, or steam-powered pumps to pump out mines. This was all people who learned as they went and just had an aptitude for building boilers and doing the tight welds and joins that were needed to create a sealed boiler, so that sufficient pressure could be built to drive machinery and this sort of this. These were all self-taught people, but nonetheless they had that expertise, and they were able to get the investment and support needed from the aristocrats on the basis that they could still receive a decent share of the action, and where there were even things like the Dutch were probably first off the mark on this, but the Dutch followed shortly by the English, having joint stock companies and corporations and things like that. This was something that was fairly new, and only on the basis of the law would be, the law would protect your private property, would people be prepared to go ahead. And this was a two-way thing. If the aristocrat was going to pour a lot of money and resources into, paying for a ship to be built, or for allowing the blacksmith to build the boiler that was going to drive the steam engine, all these sorts of things, people wanted their investments and their ingenuity and their inventions and their time and so on protected by law. So this was something that was unique to English society, which spread to other societies later, but it was unique to English society, this protection. Now, if you're going to have these sort of people creating wealth, you considerably broaden your tax base in two ways. One is you vastly increase the amount of trade, and you can tax that, which again was the primary source of trade, a primary source of tax extraction at the time. But in order to get this broadened tax extraction, you had to bestow on people legal rights and protections, and that in turn had a big effect on the politics and the governmental structure and the laws that were passed, the independence of courts. There was a whole lot of things that fed into this and created, if you like, a momentum for more of the same, because this created wealth for everybody. And if you look at the taxation base that the English state had, say in the Napoleonic Wars, bear in mind Napoleon controlled pretty much all of Europe at the time, or at least held it in sway, and the British, which their population, about a third of the French population, were able to economically outlast, by a considerable distance, by the way, outlast the French, and were able to maintain constant subsidies to European states to fight Napoleon, put armies in the field to fight Napoleon, which drained French resources, and also to maintain a huge fleet of battleships on the oceans. And so they could have squadrons patrolling the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Pacific. I mean, they had just, the English had squadron, British had squadrons of ships running everywhere, and they were able to maintain all that and pay for it with I think it was a 2% income tax on top, because they were getting desperate for cash. But this indicates the extent of the wealth that was, I would argue, a direct extension of, and went hand in hand with the freedoms. If the people were restricted in these areas, they had no freedoms, no protections, and so on under law, then none of these innovations or inventions would have happened or occurred, or the investments in them in the first place, because nobody would be willing to risk anything. Just exploit the fuck out of the peasants and you're good to go, which is, of course, what happens in the third world countries. So this ability to look at the future and say, okay, well, I'll bust my ass building a ship now, or again a boiler to drive steam engines, which is a special sort of technology in itself, by the way. A boiler, getting those welds and those seals right so they don't explode and kill everybody. That is in itself an industrial age technology. But that takes time to put together, and time to build, and time to craft, and it needs all sorts of equipment to bring it into being. So that time and investment, people want to know and need to know, and won't do it if they haven't got these protections under law for private property, private profit, and so on. So it was these protections and the broadening of the tax base that created, I believe, or not in isolation, but were essential in the creating of the wealth and mercantile age, which in effect was reinvested back into the industrial age. And again, this small, the small population, it's between 7 and 10 million, and it's, as it all kicked off, windswept and rain-swept island off the coast of Europe. It all happened there, and this is a direct relationship of these freedoms and protections under law. You've been Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.